The rope creaked before the man did. It stretched tight above the wooden platform. Fibers groaning under the weight of a body that looked like it had already given up long before it was lifted there. Dust swirled in the late afternoon wind, crawling low across the ground, like something alive slipping between boots and wagon wheels, settling into the cracks of dry lips and tired eyes. The crowd had gathered early, not out of sympathy, but for the spectacle. A man in a black coat stood on the raised platform, his voice loud and sharp as a whip, cutting through the murmurs. He lifted a gloved hand, pointing down at the figure bound at the wrists. "Look at him," he called, a grin curling at the corner of his mouth. "Old, worn out, barely worth the rope he stands under." Laughter broke out, harsh, easy. The man on the platform did not respond. His head hung low, chin nearly touching his chest. Gray hair clung in uneven strands across his face. His clothes were little more than torn fabric hanging from a frame that had once been strong, but now looked hollowed out by time and hardship. "Do I hear $10? The auctioneer shouted. Silence answered him. A few men exchanged glances. One spat into the dirt. "5 then," the auctioneer snapped, voice tightening. "Surely one of you can find a use for a pair of hands, even if they barely work." More laughter. Someone from the back called out, "You'd pay me to take him." The crowd roared again. The wind picked up, carrying the sound across the square, over the wooden storefronts, past the hitching posts, and into the open land beyond where nothing answered back. At the edge of the crowd, she stood still. Her hands were clenched so mate around a small leather pouch that her knuckles had turned pale. The fabric of her dress was faded, worn thin at the sleeves. Dust clung to the hem where it brushed the ground. No one paid her much attention. They rarely did. She had learned to move like a shadow through this town. Quiet. Invisible. A woman alone did not draw respect here. Only curiosity, sometimes pity, more often disdain. She had buried her husband 3 months ago. The memory came without warning. A flash of dirt falling against wood. The hollow sound of it. The way the men who helped her lower the coffin had left quickly afterward, not meeting her eyes. He had been strong once, stronger than most, and still the land had taken him. A broken axle, a pinned leg, a fever that followed, and then silence. Since then, the farm had begun to die in slow, cruel pieces. Fences sagging, fields hardening, livestock thinning, and debt growing, always growing. She shifted her weight eyes, lifting toward the platform again. The old man had not moved, not once. Not even when the laughter rose around him. Not even when the auctioneer stepped closer and grabbed his chin, forcing his face up for the crowd to see. "Come on now," the man mocked, shaking his head. "At least pretend you're alive." The old man's face came into view, and for a moment something changed. His skin was lined, deep, carved by years that had not been kind. His beard was uneven, streaked with gray and dirt. But his eyes, they were not empty. They were not weak. They were watching. Not the crowd, not the auctioneer, but something beyond them all. The woman felt it before she understood it. A stillness beneath the noise, a weight in the air. The auctioneer released his grip, clearly unimpressed. "Fine then," he snapped. $3, final call. Anyone." Silence again. The crowd was losing interest. A few men turned away. Others began to drift back toward the saloon, already bored of the show. The woman's grip tightened around the pouch. Inside it was everything she had left. Coins worn smooth from passing hands. A few bills folded so many times they barely held shape anymore. It was meant for seed, for feed, for survival. She swallowed. The wind pushed against her back as if urging her forward. or warning her not to move at all. $2, the auctioneer barked, frustration now bleeding into his voice. Last chance before I cut him loose and let him rot where he stands. A man near the front chuckled. He'll be dead before sunset anyway. More laughter. The woman stepped forward. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it carried her out of the shadows and into the edge of the crowd. A few heads turned, not in interest, in confusion. She kept walking. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the ground itself was trying to hold her back. The platform loomed closer. The old man did not move, but his eyes shifted, just slightly, toward her. $1, the auctioneer said, throwing his hands up. That's it. $1 for a useless old... I'll take him. Her voice cut through the noise, not loud, but clear. The crowd went quiet. For a moment, even the wind seemed to pause. The auctioneer blinked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. What was that? She stepped closer now, fully in view. I said I'll take him. A murmur spread through the crowd. Confusion turned quickly into amusement. Someone laughed, then another. And soon the square filled again with that same harsh sound, only louder now, sharper, aimed directly at her. The auctioneer looked her up and down, taking in the worn dress, the tired eyes, the thinness she could not hide. You, he said slowly. You're buying him. She reached into the pouch and pulled out the coins. They clinked softly in her palm. Yes. The laughter grew. A man leaned toward his friend. She's finally lost it. That farm of hers already half dead, another added. Now she's bringing home a corpse to finish it off. The auctioneer smirked, clearly entertained now. Well, he said, spreading his arms wide. I suppose even the worthless deserve a home. More laughter. He held out his hand. She stepped forward and placed the money into it. The coins felt heavier as they left her fingers, like something final, like a door closing. The auctioneer counted quickly, barely hiding his grin. Pleasure doing business, he said. He turned and cut the rope binding the old man's wrists. The man swayed slightly as the tension released. For a second, it looked like he might fall, but he didn't. He straightened, slowly, carefully. The movement was small, but it changed something. A few in the crowd noticed. The laughter softened just a fraction. The woman stepped closer, unsure of what to do now that he was hers. The word felt strange, heavy, wrong. He stood in front of her, taller than she had expected, once he was no longer hunched. His shoulders were broad beneath the torn fabric. His hands, though scarred and rough, hung steady at his sides. Up close, she could see the marks on him. Old wounds. Deep ones. Not the kind a man earns from age alone. He looked down at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without a word, he turned and stepped off the platform. She followed. The crowd parted not out of respect, but to get a better look as they passed. Whispers trailed behind them. Fool. She's finished. Won't last the winter. At the edge of the square, a man stood waiting. He had not laughed. Not once. His coat was cleaner than the rest. His boots polished. A silver watch chain glinted against his vest. His eyes were fixed on the woman, cold, calculating. He stepped slightly into her path. Miss Carter, he said smoothly. She stopped. Her jaw tightened. Mr. Hale. He glanced past her at the old man, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then the faintest smile touched his lips. Interesting purchase. She said nothing. He leaned in just enough that only she could hear him. You're running out of time, he said quietly. That land of yours, it won't hold much longer. Debts don't wait for miracles. Her grip tightened at her sides. I'm aware. His eyes flicked once more to the old man. I do hope, he added, voice almost amused now, that whatever you think you bought today was worth the last of your coin. He stepped back, giving her space to pass. As she moved around him, she could feel his gaze following her, measuring, waiting. The road out of town stretched ahead dry and uneven, leading back toward the land that was barely holding together. The old man walked beside her in silence, his pace steady, unhurried. Behind them, the town slowly swallowed the noise again, laughter fading, voices returning to their usual rhythm. But something had shifted. She could feel it, even if she didn't understand it yet. They walked for a long time before she finally spoke. "You don't have to stay," she said, her voice quieter now, carried only between them. "I won't stop you." He did not answer. They kept walking. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. Fields began to appear in the distance. Her fields. Dry. Cracked. Waiting. "I don't have much," she continued, more to the silence than to him. "But there's work, if you're able." Still nothing. Only the sound of boots against dirt. They reached the edge of the property as the last light of day stretched thin across the horizon. The fence leaned in places, broken in others. The barn stood crooked, one side sagging under its own weight. A few thin cattle lifted their heads as they approached, ribs showing through skin. She stopped. This was it. Everything she had left. She turned slightly, as if to say something more, but the words didn't come. The old man stepped past her. He paused near the fence, his gaze moving slowly across the land. From the barn, to the fields, to the distant line of trees. He said nothing, but his eyes were no longer distant. They were measuring, reading, remembering. Behind them, far off on the road, a single rider had stopped, watching. The man in the clean coat sat tall in his saddle, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. He did not move. He did not call out. He only watched and waited. Night did not fall gently over the land. It came hard, pushed in by a wind that carried the smell of distant rain and something colder beneath it. The sky darkened too quickly, clouds swallowing the last light before it could settle. The field seemed to shrink under the weight of it, shadows stretching long and uneasy across the broken fence lines. Inside the house, she moved in silence, setting a small lantern on the table, its weak glow barely pushing back the dark. The boards creaked under her steps. Everything in this place felt worn thin, like it had been holding its breath for too long. The old man stood near the doorway. He had not asked for anything. Not food, not water, not even a place to sit. He only stood still as a post eyes tracing the walls, the ceiling the small details most would ignore. "You can rest there," she said quietly, nodding toward a corner where an old blanket lay folded. He didn't move. She hesitated, then turned back to the small stove, adding a piece of wood to the weak fire. It crackled sparks, rising briefly before fading. The first sound came from outside, a sharp crack, then another. She froze. The wind picked up, howling, now rattling the loose boards along the barn. Something heavy slammed against wood in the distance. The cattle began to stir, low, restless sounds carrying through the night. She stepped toward the door, pulling it open just enough to look out. The sky had broken. Rain came down in hard sheets, slashing sideways in the wind. The yard was already turning to mud water pooling fast in the low ground. A section of the fence had given way, swinging loose, barely holding on. "No," she whispered under her breath. Another crack echoed, this time closer. The barn door slammed open one hinge, snapping under the force. The cattle inside panicked, their bodies pressing against each other, eyes wide, hooves slipping in the wet ground. She didn't think. She ran. The wind hit her like a wall, nearly knocking her off her feet, as she stepped into the storm. Rain soaked through her clothes in seconds, hair whipping across her face as she pushed forward. "Easy," she called out, voice swallowed by the storm. "Easy." But the animals were beyond listening. One broke free, charging through the open fence, vanishing into the dark. Another followed, then another. The rest began to surge, pushing toward the gap. She grabbed at a rope slipping in the mud, trying to pull the broken section back into place. It barely moved. "Stop!" she shouted, desperation rising. "Stop!" A horn caught her shoulder, spinning her sideways. She hit the ground hard, breath leaving her in a sharp gasp. Mud splashed up cold and thick against her skin. The cattle thundered past her. She tried to stand, but her foot slid again, sending her down a second time. The storm swallowed everything. Sound. Light. Control. Then something changed. A shape moved through the rain. Fast. Not stumbling. Not hesitating. The old man. He came out of the dark, like he had been carved from it, his steps, sure, his body low and steady against the wind. He didn't call out. Didn't shout. He moved. A rope snapped tight in his hands as he swung it wide, catching the lead animal across the chest, pulling it sideways with a force that shouldn't have been there. The beast fought hooves digging into the mud, but the man held firm boots, planted deep. Another animal surged past. He turned, grabbed its horn, twisting sharply, forcing its head down, redirecting its momentum back toward the barn. The movements were quick, precise, each one controlled. Not wild, not desperate, like he had done this 1,000 times before. She pushed herself up, staring through the rain, barely able to believe what she was seeing. The man who had stood silent, barely moving, now moved like something else entirely. Strong. Unyielding. He drove the cattle back, step by step, forcing them through the broken doorway, slamming a loose board into place to block their escape. One animal tried to break again, but he struck the ground hard beside it, the sound sharp enough to stop it in place. The storm raged around them, but inside the chaos, he carved order out of it. She stumbled toward him, grabbing hold of a loose post, trying to steady herself. "We can't hold it!" she shouted, though her voice barely carried. "The fence is gone," he didn't answer. He moved to the fence line, grabbing the broken section, hauling it upright with both hands. The wood creaked under the strain, but he forced it into place, wedging it against another post. She ran to him, grabbing the rope, helping where she could. Together they pulled a tie had braced. The wind fought them. The rain blinded them. But the fence held. Barely. Minutes stretched. Or maybe it was longer. Time lost meaning in the storm. Eventually, the worst of it passed. The wind softened. The rain slowed. The night settled into a heavy, dripping silence. She leaned against the fence chest, rising and falling hard, every muscle shaking from the strain. The old man stood a few feet away, breathing steady. His hands still gripping the rope. Water ran down his face, cutting through the dirt and dust, revealing the lines beneath. She looked at him differently now, not as something broken, not as something useless, but as something she had not understood. "Who are you?" she breathed, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He didn't answer. He only released the rope and turned back toward the house. She watched him go, the shape of him moving through the dim light. Shoulders, broad steps. Sure, despite the mud, the silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. Morning came gray and cold. The storm had left its mark. The yard was torn up, deep tracks, carved into the ground. One section of the fence leaned badly, barely standing. The barn door hung crooked wood, splintered where it had given way. But the cattle were alive. All of them. She stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, taking it in. It could have been worse. It should have been worse. Behind her, the old man stepped out. He moved without hesitation, heading straight for the damaged fence. He picked up a fallen plank, testing its weight, then set to work. No words, no pause, just action. She watched him for a moment, then stepped out to join him. They worked side by side. He showed her how to brace the posts deeper into the ground, how to tie the rope tighter so it wouldn't slip under pressure. His hands guided hers once briefly firm, but not rough, positioning the knot just right. Like that, she murmured more to herself than to him. He stepped back, letting her finish. Hours passed. The sun pushed weakly through the clouds, casting a pale light over the land. Piece by piece, the farm began to stand again. Later, near the well, he crouched, studying the ground. His fingers pressed into the dirt, testing its moisture, its texture. He looked toward the far edge of the field, where the soil had cracked deeper than the rest. Then he stood and walked there. She followed. He pointed once, then began to dig. Not randomly, not blindly, in a straight line. She watched, confused at first, then grabbed a shovel and joined him. The ground was hard, stubborn, but beneath it, the soil changed. Darker, damp, a hidden line of water buried just deep enough to be missed. Her breath caught. "You knew," she said softly. He didn't look up, but his movements slowed just slightly. They worked until their hands were raw, until the shallow trench connected, guiding the water where it needed to go. When it finally flowed thin but steady, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. Hope. Small. Fragile. But there. That evening they sat on opposite sides of the porch. The sky burned orange and gold as the sun dipped low light stretching across the fields, catching on the repaired fence, the barn, the narrow line of water cutting through the earth. She glanced at him to tell him. He sat still, as always, eyes on the horizon. "You didn't have to stay," she said quietly. He didn't respond. A long silence passed. Then, almost too soft to hear his voice came. "I know." It was the first word he had spoken. Low, rough, like it had not been used in a long time. She looked at him surprised, but he didn't say anything more. The silence returned. But now it felt different. Not empty, not distant. Something had begun, and neither of them could turn back from it. The days that followed did not bring peace. They brought a quiet that felt too thin, like ice, stretched over deep water. Repairs continued. The fence stood straighter now. The trench carried a narrow ribbon of water through the field, and the cattle moved with less panic in their steps. From a distance, the farm almost looked alive again, but something lingered at the edges. Watching. Waiting. She felt it most in the mornings when the air still held the night's chill, and the land had not yet woken. She would step outside, draw a slow breath, and feel that weight settle on her chest again. The kind that comes before something breaks. It came sooner than she expected. They arrived just after midday. Dust rose on the horizon. First, a low cloud pushed forward by hooves. Then, shapes formed inside it. Riders. More than a few. Moving in a straight line, deliberate, unhurried. She stood near the well, hands still damp from pulling water, and watched as they came closer. He was at the front. Mr. Hale. Clean coat. Polished boots. The same calm, cold eyes. Behind him, men with rifles slung loose faces. Hard expressions, empty of anything that might resemble doubt. They did not stop at the edge of the land. They rode straight in. The cattle shifted uneasy. One backed away, lowing softly. She wiped her hands on her dress and stepped forward. "This is private land," she said, her voice steady, though her pulse was not. You have no right. I have every right. Hale cut in smoothly, swinging down from his horse. He brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve, as if the land itself offended him. One of the men behind him dismounted, unrolling a piece of paper. Hale took it, glanced at it briefly, then held it out. Debt notice, he said. Final claim. You've had your time. She didn't take the paper. I told you, she said. I need more. You had more, he replied. His tone still calm, almost bored. You chose to spend it. His eyes flicked once briefly toward the old man standing near the barn. Something sharp moved beneath that calm. A knowing, a calculation. You bought yourself a burden instead of a future. The men behind him spread out slightly, their boots pressing into the dirt-marking territory that was not theirs. We're here to collect, Hale continued. The land, the livestock, whatever remains of value. Her throat tightened. This farm is all I have. Not for much longer. He gestured once. The men began to move. One headed toward the barn, another toward the cattle, a third toward the house. No, she said, stepping forward. You can't just take. A hand shoved her back. Hard. She stumbled, barely catching herself before hitting the ground. The old man moved. It was subtle at first, a shift in weight, a step forward. Then he stood between her and the men. Still silent, still steady. Hale watched him with quiet interest. And what exactly do you think you're going to do? He asked. The old man said nothing. One of the hired men laughed, stepping closer. Move aside, old-timer, he muttered, reaching out to shove him. The moment his hand made contact, it ended. The old man's arm moved. Fast. He caught the man's wrist, twisted sharply, and the sound that followed was not loud, but it was enough. A crack. The man dropped to his knees, a strangled cry caught in his throat. Silence fell, not the empty kind, the kind that comes just before violence. Hale's expression changed, only slightly, but enough. Careful, he said softly, though the word carried weight now. You don't know what you're stepping into. The old man finally lifted his head fully. His eyes met Hale's, and something passed between them. Recognition. Hale's jaw tightened. Well, he said. After a moment, voice thinner than before. That is interesting. The men behind him shifted, uncertain now. The old man stepped forward once. Not aggressive, not rushed, but certain. Hale held his gaze, then gave a small, humorless smile. You should have stayed buried, he said quietly. The words hung in the air. The woman frowned, confusion cutting through the fear. What does that mean? She asked, looking between them. Neither answered her. Instead, a voice came from the edge of the property, old, shaking. I know that man. Heads turned. An elderly figure stood near the fence line, leaning heavily on a cane. One of the town's oldest residents, rarely seen this far out. He took a few slow steps forward, eyes fixed on the old man. No, he whispered. It can't be. The old man did not look at him, but the silence around him deepened. The elder swallowed hard. You built this place, he said louder now. Years ago. Before all of this. The woman's breath caught. What? She said. Hale's smile faded completely. The elder continued, voice gaining strength as memory returned. You weren't just some drifter. You owned land. More than most. You carved water into dead soil. Brought life where nothing would grow. He pointed a trembling finger toward the ground beneath their feet. This land, it was yours. The words landed heavy. The woman turned slowly toward the old man, searching his face for something she had missed. That's not possible, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hale exhaled sharply, then gave a small laugh. though there was no humor in it. "Stories," he said. "Old men clinging to ghosts." But his eyes betrayed him. A flicker. Unease. The elder shook his head. "You took it from him, he said now, looking directly at Hale. "Everyone knew. Paperwork twisted. Signatures forced. You buried the truth and called it law." The men behind Hale shifted again, their confidence cracking. The woman stepped forward, heart pounding. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice directed at the old man now. For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly he reached into his coat. The movement alone made the hired men tense, hands drifting toward their weapons. But he did not draw a gun. He pulled out something worn, folded, carefully. A piece of paper aged and creased from years of being carried. He held it out. She took it with shaking hands. The ink was faded, but still legible. A deed. Names. Boundaries. Marks that matched the land around them. Her eyes moved across the page, breath catching with each line. "It's real," she whispered. Hale's calm broke. "You think that changes anything?" he snapped, stepping forward. "That paper means nothing now. The law was built on lies." The elder cut in. The old man stepped forward again. This time there was no hesitation, no silence left. His voice came low, rough, but clear. "It ends here." The words carried across the land like a line drawn in stone. Hale's hand moved first, toward his gun. The old man was faster. The distance between them vanished in a single step. A hand struck Hale's wrist, knocking the weapon aside. The gun hit the ground, lost in the dirt. One of the hired men lunged forward. The old man turned his fist, driving into the man's chest, sending him back hard enough to knock the wind from him. Another swung. Missed. The old man moved through them, not wild, not reckless. Precise. Each strike placed. Each movement controlled. Years of silence breaking in a matter of seconds. The fight ended as quickly as it began. The hired men stepped back, not defeated, but unwilling. Hale stood there, breathing harder now, the clean lines of his composure cracked. Around them, more figures appeared. Townfolk, drawn by the noise, by the truth finally breaking the surface. They watched, whispered, and slowly their attention turned, not to Hale, but away from him. The shift was subtle, but final. Hale looked around, seeing it, understanding it. For the first time, he had no ground left to stand on. He took a step back, then another. "This isn't over," he said, though the words held less weight now. But no one moved to follow him. No one agreed. He turned, mounting his horse with sharp movements, and rode off without another word. The men followed. Dust rose again, then settled. Silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. The woman stood in the center of it, the deed still in her hands, her heart still racing. She looked at the old man, at the man she had bought for almost nothing, the man who had stood between her and everything she was about to lose. "You knew," she said softly. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The elder approached slowly, nodding once deeply to the old man. "Should have never been taken from you," he murmured. The old man said nothing. He only turned, walking back toward the barn. The woman followed. Days passed, then weeks. The land changed. Slowly, but surely. The waterline deepened. The soil softened. Green began to push through where only dust had lived before. The cattle grew stronger. The fence stood firm. The barn was rebuilt piece by piece, and the house felt less empty. He stayed, not as something owned, but as something rooted. They worked together often in silence, their movements falling into rhythm without needing words. Sometimes at dusk, they would sit on the porch again, watching the land breathe. She glanced at him one evening, the light catching the lines of his face softer now somehow. "You could have left," she said. "I didn't," he replied. That was all. But it was enough. The wind moved gently across the fields, now carrying the sound of life instead of loss. She looked out over it, then back at him. Not with doubt, not with uncertainty, but with something steady, something earned. The past had not disappeared, but it no longer ruled this place. The farm stood, stronger than before, and so did they. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.